Hi, I'm Michael Young, co-director of NC State's Digital Games Research Center. You're about to watch a talk by Chris Hazard. Chris is a PhD student here in computer science and also one of the co-founders of Hazardous software. Chris is going to give a great talk about their game Acron. Acron is a game that uses time travel as a central element of the gameplay. It's very interesting from a research perspective. Before you get started, I want to let you know that we had some technical problems recording the beginning of Chris's talk. So his introduction is cut off. You'll come in right when he starts the main body of his talk, so you're not going to miss anything significant. And before you go, I wanted to let you know that if you're interested in more detail about the talks and the Future of Games series, you can go to our website, dgrc.ncsu.edu, and sign up for the mailing list. Enjoy the talk.
So this shows you when the things occur and allows you to move around as well, to change your position. So here's the present, the little red line, and the blue line indicates when you are. And so what I'm going to do here is there's going to be some enemies down in this direction. I'm going to go attack them, but first I'm going to set up a few things. So first I'm going to take this unit here, this mech, and just go build another chronoport gate. And you'll see what that does in a few minutes. So he's just going to walk over there and construct another building just like that one. You can see down here in the timeline the statistics. So he just built something so it shows up as a green mark. So it gives you sort of an idea of a map of time, of when things are happening. Now we just jump back to the present. So as you can see, I just jumped back and built this, but now we're at the present and it hasn't caught up yet. That's because it takes time for the past to catch up to the future. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The time is pushed up by these little things we call time waves, which are sort of hard to see on this screen, but they're little blue lines that bring the past with them to the future. Each of them is an independent simulation running. And as you can see, that flash that just occurred, it brought the past up to the present, and now the building is there. So the history has now merged with the present. Now we've moved the units down to attack the enemy, and they're fighting right there. You can see on the timeline as well the attacks being dealt out and the attacks received. So the blue is the damage we've sent out, the red is the amount that we're getting back. So now let's say that that battle didn't turn out so well. We wanted to win better. So let's build some more things. So this green mark indicates that we just built 3 more mechs up there. And now we're rewatching the battle. You can see the 3 mechs that just popped out of the factories. We're also playing in fast forward now. You can change the rate at which you move through time as well. So if you look at the end of the battle, there's only about there'll be 1 tank that's left. And that's it. That's all that survived. So what we want to do is we want to take these 3 mechs we just built, take them back to the past, and have them help out in that battle. So we're going to walk them over to this area where the chronoporters are, and that'll allow them it'll allow them to go back in time and then fight alongside the previous selves, or just affect the past. So here we're going to tell them to go back in time. These things will spin up. And it'll also pull the player at the same time back in time. So you can see the yellow mark indicating that, that units have traveled through time. That's an indication of the chronoports, as we call them. So now we just took these 3 mechs that time traveled and attached them as a subordinate to the tank right there. So they'll follow all of the orders that the tank does. And as you can see, in just another minute, when these guys pop out, those 3 mechs, those are the ones that we created. Well, they're fighting down here. These are the older versions of those mechs. And they're surrounded by yellow circles to indicate that the mechs need to travel through time to keep the same causality. So if something interrupts them from going back in time, the past is going to change. Everything that those mechs have helped out will be undone. Now the past hasn't caught up to the present yet. You can see that the tank is still sitting there. That's the only thing left after the battle. But now that the mechs have helped out, the past is catching up. And now we have a different result from the battle. So like I said, that's just sort of to give you an idea of what Acron is, what it can do. And here's an outline of what we'll be talking about for the rest of the talk. So I'm going to start talking about some time travel taxonomy, both from science fiction and games. There's been a lot of work done out there about it. A lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time. After that, I'm going to go through how time travel affects gameplay. And there's all these different types of mechanisms that we can have. For example, undoing, reversing time, having different time velocities, editing the timeline itself, chronoporting, and different ways of overlaying and branching. Now each of these, some of them are orthogonal, some of them play together, but I'll talk about them each in time. And then I'll talk about how, once you've implemented some of these, how they actually affect the game development process itself. Because there's a lot of implications, both in terms of how you need to design the engine and in terms of how it affects the development process itself. So as I said, time travel has been widely discussed in science fiction for a very long time. And there's all sorts of different types of time travel that people have come up with. So one is the, the infamous immutable timeline, where things happen and somebody realizes, oh, there's this tragic event that happened in the past, let me go try to fix it. So the person time travels, they go back in time, they do their best, and inadvertently cause that thing that they were trying to prevent. And the timeline never changes. But how did it get that way in the first place? So this is one type of time travel plot device. 12 Monkeys, that movie is a good example of it. Now, what if the timeline itself can actually change, if it's mutable? Now, if anybody's seen the movie Primer, in that movie, the time travelers keep going back in time and changing things. They'll kidnap their, spoiling the movie for anybody, they'll kidnap one of their previous selves and try to act in that person's place and keep on layering all these complexities on top of it. There's also different dimensions of time. If you think about time instead of just being a forward and backward thing, what if there's a whole plane of time? What if you can say, well, if we change this one thing, we're actually going off in a different vector, a different possible future. There's merging changes. Back to the Future, an example I like to talk about is McFly is sitting there looking at the picture of his parents, and the picture is fading because of the things that he's changed in the past, but he's still there. He's not fading yet. And so it's this gradual process of taking time for the past to catch up to the present, or whenever you are. Then there's also precognition, like, for example, The Shining, Minority Report. And precognition is another form of time travel where things aren't traveling through time, but information is. And you can find precognition going back a long time in literature. Another one is the repeat timeline. Groundhog Day is probably the best example of that, where somebody or some entity keeps going back to the same point in time. Maybe they keep information, they remember what happened, maybe they keep some artifact, but in general, they keep playing the same thing over and over again, hopefully to try to learn how to do things different. Within the mechanisms themselves, there's also different ways of how the time travel physics itself works. For example, there's different ways of how the past catches up to the future. In the movie The Butterfly Effect, the main character goes back in time, changes something, and bam, everything is caught up. It's instant. The changes in the past are now there in the present. For example, comparatively Back to the Future I mentioned before, where it takes the time for the past to catch up and the picture fades. There's also different ways you can travel through time. You can be instant, like Doctor who hops in his TARDIS and then, bam, he's back in time. Or it can be more like H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, where it takes you time to move back in time or move forward in time. So now that I've talked about that, I'll talk about time travel with respect to video games. Now I've sort of categorized the different types of time travel that have been done so far in games. And just loosely, and I'll talk about them each individually. Story only, time zones, time loop, reverse time, fixed jump back, and freeform. The first one is story only. It's been done in video games for a very long time. It's a plot device. We need to travel back in time and collect some artifact, and that's our motivation for playing the game. But it's just the story. That's it. Maybe you'll have different art assets for different levels, but that's about all there is to it. Command and Conquer is an infamous RTS for having that type of time travel. A little bit more complicated, and this is sort of a canonical example, Chrono Trigger, where you have different zones. They're like different levels in the game that you travel between, but there's some sort of tie, there's some sort of trigger or mechanism. So when you affect something in one level, it also affects the other. So if I go back in time, I change something, there's a pre-scripted event that will cause something else differently in this other level. If I go back in time and help somebody conquer some other place, he'll have conquered that in this other level. A couple other games coming out soon, neither of these are out yet. Darkest of Days, they have a very similar Chrono Trigger-like mechanism. And Singularity is pretty interesting because what they do is they only have two levels, 1950 and I think 2020, I believe. But you can hop between them very smoothly and seamlessly. So you just, you have this time travel device and you just sort of slide from one to the other through a portal. Another is Time Loop, which is more like Groundhog Day, where you keep playing the same thing over and over again. Majora's Mask, the Zelda game, is again sort of a canonical example of this, where you keep playing in this game the same 3 days over and over again. At the end of the third day, the moon crashes to the earth. You lose most of your items, but you get to keep certain ones. and certain things stay unlocked. So it's all figuring out what you get to keep and what you don't. Then there's reversing time. Time Shift is a first-person shooter game where you can reverse time. I think it's like 5 or 10 seconds or so. So, you know, a bridge just got blown up. Okay, let's reverse time. Quick run across the bridge, and then, you know, it's before it blows up. They do have multiplayer, but the way they do multiplayer is it's just everyone else freezes. So if you're reversing time, the scene itself, all of the models in the game will reverse, except for the other players just sort of sit there. Braid is another great example. It's a platform single-player game where you're jumping around. You know, think Super Mario Brothers, except there's all these different time velocities where if you walk forward in one level, time goes forward. When you turn around and walk the other way, time goes backward. And there's all sorts of different temporal mechanisms with reversing time in that game. A sort of newer model of time travel in gaming is what I call fixed jump back. And there's maybe about 5 games that do this so far. PB Winterbottom is probably the best example. I believe this is out of USC, where what happens is when you touch something purple, you get a clone of yourself, and now you can interact with that past version of yourself. It's like you time traveled back in time some number of seconds, and now you're both there. So if anybody's played, for example, Mario Kart, you play against your Ghost Racer, you know, your best time, the best lap you've ever done. Well, in this type of model, the Ghost Racer is actually something physical. So you can bump your Ghost Racer off the track and interact with it. And you can keep on having more and more copies. There's a couple other Flash games like Chronotron, Timebot, and there's a new one called Time Donkey that's coming out, where it's a 3D game where you keep interacting with your previous clones of yourself. So then the final example is Freeform, which is Acron, which is sort of a superset of many of these, where you don't have different levels that you jump between. Time itself is actually continuous, and you can take things, send them back in time, just like the fixed jump back, and it sort of merges many of these and is a superset as well. So to begin with, why do we want to add time manipulation to games? Well, first, it's a new and different kind of gameplay experience. You know, people want to play something new. They don't want to play the same game over and over and over again. Another is if, you know, the IP or franchise, whatever you're making a Terminator game where, you know, a large strategy game where you want to model Skynet traveling back in time, or maybe you're making a Back to the Future game. Well, then you want, you know, time travel adds a lot to the gameplay because it's part of the franchise. Another one is the difficulty level of games. Now, you know, as I've gotten older, I've played less games. I've just had a lot less time. And when I sit down and I play something, you know, I want to experience it. I want to have fun. I don't want to play the same Super Mario Brothers 1 level again over and over and over again, you know, 30 times in order to master it. I want to, you know, have the full experience. So time travel and time manipulation give me, it sort of transforms the game into different types of puzzles. So I can say, oops, I made a mistake. Let me, you know, my thumbs aren't quite as good as they used to be. Let me redo that. Another application that we'd planned for initially, but we were surprised by just the overwhelming response for, is serious gaming, serious applications of this. So the first thing is teaching causality. Now, if you play Acron a lot, you're always thinking about the longer term effects. You jump back in time. What are the results of this decision going to be? You know, 5, 10 minutes from now. And you need to think about that for every single action. And if you make a mistake, you say, oops, you know, I should have done this differently. So let me go back and fix that. And you start to learn what everything does. You learn the sensitivity of things. And that sort of bleeds into sensitivity analysis. So let's say you're not a quantitative person. You're more of a qualitative. You want to feel what things can I mess with in the simulation such that, you know, it's not going to change the result, or what do I need to be really careful about and plan very well for. And it sort of gives you a different way of interfacing with the simulation that blurs the line between committed and hypothetical. Because you can say, well, I think I want to do this, but, you know, I want to change my mind. Let me go back and change that. And the last application is collaborative planning. And if you think about it, if you're all editing a document at the same time, there are, you know, one person's editing one page, another person's editing another page, and you have some process that merges them, you know, some change control process. Well, this is sort of a way to do this for situated plans. So you can have multiple domain experts saying, well, you know, for search and rescue, you know, let's move these guys over here, let's move these guys over here. Now what, you know, oh, I see that we discovered something else, let's undo that and change this. So it's a way to sort of merge those type of plans in real time. We've had actually a lot of interest in this from the military for business modeling and things like that already. So now that I've talked about, you know, why to add time travel, what types of time travel can we do, now how do these different models of time travel actually affect gameplay, and what are they? So I'll talk about each of these individually. The first is just being able to undo, change the past, reversing your time direction, editing the timeline, sending things across time, chronoporting, and then talk a little bit about how you manage the different branches of time and how you merge them. The first one is pretty easy. Everybody who's ever hit Control-Z knows what this is, undoing. Now imagine if you're playing a game and oops, I made a mistake. Let me jump back and redo that. Well, lives in games are actually exactly that. You have 5 undos, and each undo brings you back to the beginning of a level. Now there's a whole community around emulated games and people who do tool-assisted run-throughs that do things that look physically impossible in a game. They time every jump perfectly and beat a 10-hour game in 15 minutes. And it effectively allows you to play the perfect game. Now, each of these different models I'm going to talk about, this is the transformations of gameplay. This is sort of preliminary work, just sort of from a conceptual level, but to think, if we add this time manipulation, how does it affect gameplay? Now, suppose that suppose you add the ability to undo a game. What does it do to that? What type of equivalent game does it become? Now, in computer science, we talk about NP-complete problems a lot. Optimization problems. All these different possible ways of doing it. Well, if you have all these different buttons you can press, it starts turning things into an optimization problem. Now, one of the things that happens is things turn into a maze. I just like this example because the answer is kind of obvious. But let's say that you have an obstacle combat course. Think like a Final Fantasy game. You want to. There's a couple different things you want to do. One is you want to loot. You want to find loot. You want to find enemies that give you good things and target them because you don't want to waste your time fighting enemies that don't give you anything. And so, oops, I fought an enemy that I didn't want to run into. Let me undo that and try to find another one. Or maybe I'm trying to make it my way to the boss without getting hit. So I keep all of my health, keep all of my magic, keep all of my items. And so I'm going to avoid all the possible attacks. And it turns that type of a game pretty much into a maze if you can undo all the time. Another is that some games actually become winnable. If anybody's ever played Battletoads or Ninja Gaiden, you know that those games are very, very difficult. And it's extremely difficult to get that kind of result without the ability to undo. A little more complicated one is reversing the game itself. Now, there's been a lot of work in reversible computing, and it's a very interesting area. One of the things that you need to break down here is whether or not you're going to use difference or differential actions. And it's actually a pretty big difference. Difference actions are atomic, so they're discrete states. We're jumping, think about the game in terms of a state machine. And that we can reverse pretty easily. We're just sort of jumping back and moving back to the state we came from. Well, if you have differential actions, you're dealing with floating points, and the errors start accumulating. Now, by errors, I don't mean bugs, I mean statistical errors. All the floating point round-offs. So let's say we've computed, we've been playing for an hour, and now we're going to rewind 30 minutes ago. Well, the answers you get may not actually be the way it was 30 minutes ago. And so you need to make sure that you save some of the states along the way and be very careful and prudent about your error propagation. Another interesting thing about reversibility, just in general reversible computing, is that it's all about the destruction of information, where you don't destroy information in reversible computing. Think about your processor. You have dynamic and static switching costs. The static switching cost is just the leaks, but the dynamic switching cost is whenever you dump information. You're clearing out the register. You're clearing out the memory. And actually, if you think about it, that power is just the destruction of information. That's where that power is going. And so if you're not going to destroy that information, then you actually can have a lower power processor. And there's been a lot of work in that area about reversible chips. And even some reversible computing research looking at using that for security models. So we just received an attack. Let's reverse back the entire network to the point the attack did, and then replay it forward without the attack, and isolate that out. So we can apply some of those principles and those ideas to gaming. Now, to managing all this, with reversibility, you typically store the system state as deltas. So that if we want to reconstruct it back 30 minutes ago, we can just follow the deltas backwards, providing that we accounted for errors and things like that. Maybe we want to have, excuse me, some entire models of where it should be, an entire representation once in a while, sort of keyframes. And the entire state is reconstructed by traversing the timeline. So you're not going to jump from one point in time to another. You're going to rewind it or move forward. Now, if you add reversibility to a game, this has some interesting implications as well. So take your typical platform, side-scroller shooter. You're in a ship. You're shooting the bad guys. And now we're going to add the ability to reverse time, or whether we're just going to rewind the game in general. that actually turns it into something more like Guitar Hero. And this is exemplified by the indie game Retrograde. Now in Retrograde, you start at the last battle and you work your way back to the beginning of the game. And what you have to do is you have to collect every shot that you shot in order to keep the game the same way with the same result. So you need to avoid all the enemy shots, which are coming from off screen and going back into the bullet, or back into the barrel of the gun of the enemies. And so you're dodging these things and trying to time all the button presses to replay the whole thing backward. And so the experience is very much like Guitar Hero. And they even colored it the same way. With reversibility, we can have now different time velocities. Now the simplest case of this, anybody who's played a game that had a power-up or a weapon that slowed your enemy down. So the enemy is running and then he just runs like this. That's the simplest form of something having a different time velocity. But different things can actually be moving backwards in time differently. Something can be moving twice as fast backward in time. Another thing, half the speed forward. Braid does a little bit of this. Within the game itself, Singularity has some weapons where you can age a bridge. It's just an attribute of the object, of the model. But it still sort of gives the effect, oh, I'm going to age this bridge and make it crumble, or I'm going to make this bridge young again so that I can actually cross it, so that it's not all rusted out. There's a few intricacies with maintaining causality, like what does it mean to go backward in time? Do you have to redo all the things like you did Guitar Hero style, or are you actually creating causality in the opposite direction? A lot of physics, well, pretty much so far as physicists know, the universe is, for the most part, reversible. And there's all these, the laws of physics either are symmetrical or asymmetrical, whether or not the sign changes when you reverse time. But so a lot of the physics models in games can actually be reversed quite easily, depending on the optimization types, the optimization algorithms you're using. Now another type of gameplay mechanism is being able to edit the timeline itself. Now, this attribute is actually orthogonal to reversibility, meaning that if you have one, you don't necessarily have the other. So if I can rewind time, that doesn't mean that I can jump to a new point in time, because I would need to reconstruct the entire world, simulating back 30 minutes in time. But let's say I can jump to a point in time, that doesn't mean I can run backwards. The big thing about this is you need to be able to instantly reconstruct the entire world state at once. You can't have the player sitting there for 5 minutes waiting to recompute everything. It's got to be instant. And it's always a trade-off between different memory types. How many keyframes are we going to store, or how much are we going to store in deltas? And there's CPU trade-offs with there as well. Then also, how do you merge the timeline? What if somebody changes something in the past? Do we branch the timeline? I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So one of the things is if somebody goes back in time, changes the past, how does that affect the present? How does that affect the future? One is to be instant. You jump back in the past, change something, bam, now it's different in the future. The problem with that is twofold. One is that how are you going to compute 30 minutes of gameplay or 5 minutes of gameplay in that little fraction of time and still have the game responsive to the player and still be interesting? Another is, what if you have a paradox? What if somebody goes back in time and kills his grandfather? Well, how do you resolve that? Well, if you're doing it instantly, there's no good resolution there. Another way is to never resolve this, and you just keep on overlaying the timeline each time. And this is very much like the fixed jump back as I was talking about before. For example, Chronotron and Time Donkey in Winterbottom. The method that we came up with was actually having time waves. So the time waves are going to pull the past up to the present to the future. Some of the decisions here are how fast do they go. If these things are zooming by, it's a lot of CPU. But if they move too slow, then it's not as interesting. What is the distance between them? If you have a long gap between the time waves, you have a great island of stability where things aren't going to change, because this one will bring changes. 5 minutes later, this one will bring changes. But if you have a lot of them in succession, you'll end up with very small changes that move rapidly. So it's all, do you want the player to have a consistent experience for 1 minute, 2 minutes? And how big of a jump or how big of a change do you want it to bring along with it? Another is how do you spawn these time waves? We looked at different models for this. For example, what if every time you jump back in the past, you make a change, that creates a ripple in time. You make another change, that creates another ripple in time. It's very intuitive, but there's some drawbacks to that. One is in terms of performance, because what if you have 30 time waves right next to each other and then nothing for a while? Another is consistent feel for the player. So we decided to go with a constant generation of time waves, simply to keep the paradoxes oscillating between the states. It makes the gameplay very nice. And then also with the time waves, you have to worry about CPU and cache all the time because if we have 1,000 updaters, there's you need a very, very large computer to manage that. And you also need to worry about the cache. How much can we actually how much can we push through and keep on the processor itself? Another thing is that we treat the player as a time wave. So when you go back in time, you're changing something, you're actually pulling those changes along with you. Now, what actually goes on the timeline in these cases? Well, you can classify it into 3 types of information. One is a map of time. You want the player to say, oh, this is a battle that I was in. Oh, I remember what happened. Or here's when I built a bunch of units. Here's when I started building up this other base. I know that that's when that point in time is. We even have time bookmarks where you can say, here's when I want to jump back. I might want to come back to this point in time. Another is where you need to pay attention. For example, maybe you have a bunch of resources that are being unused at this point in time, so let's go back in time and actually take advantage of them. We didn't play the optimal strategy, so let's go back and fix that. Let's play the perfect game. The third is what changes in the timeline. So when is your opponent? What is your opponent doing? We have it such that when your opponent goes back in time, attacks you, and you've never seen the attack before, it actually starts flashing red, saying, hey, you need to go look at this. You're being attacked and you didn't see it before. And if you haven't watched it, then you need to know what's going on. And then also when the time waves are, so you can plan around them. So you can say, oh, change is gonna, this thing is bringing the changes along with, so I need to pay attention to that. Another thing that we did was we treat time as a resource in the game. And we do this via what we call chrono energy. Now, what chrono energy is it limits your ability to influence the past. Because if you didn't have that, everyone would just go as far back as they possibly could and keep fighting over the earliest possible time, maybe just using the future to enqueue things. Well, we treat it nonlinear, such that when you go as far back in time as you possibly can, you can only issue about 1 command. So you better make that one count. And if you go back 10 seconds ago, it doesn't matter that much for gameplay, so we'll let you issue 100 commands. And you need to go back to the present to recharge. And so it's always a battle of going back in time and then going back to the present. And the present is really what you're worried about, but you're also very worried about the past as well. Like I said, we recharge it in the present. And we have different models for how you spend it. Does it cost chrono energy to look into the future? Is it free? Because it's not really committed yet. It's just a speculative future. Another tricky point here is how do you consume chrono energy? What does it mean to change the time? So we treat each message as a cost of chrono energy. So if I say, hey, you, go do this differently, that's one message, that's one piece of chrono energy. Now, if you think about real-time strategy games, a lot of times you're dealing with groups of units. You're selecting these 10 soldiers and saying, hey, all you guys, go over here. Well, is that 10 different commands or is that one command? We decided to resolve that a little bit differently in setting up hierarchies. So instead of having a group of units, perhaps the group could even be split across the map. And now we say, okay, you group of 10 units, go here. Well, now the message isn't localized. The effect will actually be global, and you'll start causing a lot of changes across the entire timeline. Well, if we keep it more localized, then it's more consistent for the player. So what we have is hierarchical controls. So here's these 5 soldiers. They're going to report to this commander. These 5 are going to report to this commander. These 2 will report to a higher level commander. You can select the top one and tell, hey, bring this entire army across the map. So you can control an entire army with a single command way back in time. And you can also control different parts of the hierarchy as well. And this, like I said, keeps it a little bit more localized, keeps the gameplay a little bit more consistent. Now, what if we add the ability to edit a timeline to different types of games? Let's take Gran Turismo, for example, a racing game. You're driving around a track, trying to get your best time. And now you can go back in time and say, hey, I wanted to brake a little bit more here. I should have turned the steering wheel a little bit harder at this point. Well, what it does is it turns it into a stochastic optimization problem. And not even, maybe even not even a stochastic optimization problem. Because you say, oh, I could have braked a little bit more on this corner, and now I've sort of pushed the state into something else. And so now it turns the gameplay more into something like a timed version of Sudoku. Now this one is sort of interesting, a fighting game. Now if you think, what is a fighting game? It is you're going through time, you keep playing these sort of normal form games or Stackelberg games where you're issuing some number of transitive commands. You're issuing a punch or you're issuing a kick, and there's a rock, paper, scissors mechanism to it. So one beats the next beats the next, and that one beats the first one. So which do you choose? And you're doing it across time. Now let's say that you have the ability now to edit your timeline. You can go back in time and change a command that you issued. Well, it really doesn't change the gameplay all that much because you're still sort of doing the same thing. You have this overlaying time pressure on you, and you're still sort of choosing these transitive games. Yes, there's some subtle differences, but I think it's one of the closest games I've seen to an actual to the identity property under the timeline transformation that I've seen. Now another is suppose you take a game that's a survival horror game, and now you can jump back or jump to the future. Well, it doesn't really become that scary anymore because you can say, oh no, this hallway looks really creepy. Let me just press forward and skip ahead 5 minutes. Oh, I wasn't attacked. Good. Or oh, I see I was attacked. Let me just sort of inch back there and see what attacked me or what I need to worry about. And it removes a lot of the scariness from the game. I sometimes like to say that Acron has a lot of the suspense of a survival horror game, but at the same time it's not really scary because it's what can change in the past, but things aren't coming out to jump you and scare you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sending actually things through time. So I'm going to take this tank and I'm going to send this back 5 minutes in time, and ask have you seen this unit? Now what happens when we take things and send them through time? Well, there's some things we need to manage. One is control. In a real-time strategy game, you're managing the whole battlefield, so if a unit goes back in time, oh, it's just another unit in the field. But what if you're playing a first-person shooter? And now you're standing alongside of your older self or your younger self. Which one is you? So that's just something you need to worry about in terms of avatar management, in the player's experience. Another is enumeration. So let's say that I walk out of here, travel back in time, and 10 minutes later, and then walk back over here, and now there's an older version of me that just walked into the room. I'm the one with the yellow circle because I'm the young one that needs to go back in time. If you say, hey, Chris, we're both going to go what? So we both have the same name, but in the game we're actually different entities. And so you need to keep track of those separately. Now if you're going to have procedural content in the games, for example, I have certain wrinkles in my shirt, and maybe certain texture properties. Well, you want to base those on the name because if I go back in time, or if I travel through time, that version of me needs to maintain those same properties, the same look as me. And you want to base that on the name rather than the actual reference of the unit. Another is you need to maintain cause and effect so that the older always comes from the younger. So that you need to say, hey, I'm the one with the yellow circle. Let's say I get damaged. Let's say, or I change my shirt. Well, that future me is going to have that same shirt that I just had on, or the one that I changed to, or have that damage. So all that needs to be propagated as well. Now let's say that we have these chronoclones in the game. Now how does it actually affect gameplay? And these are a lot of subtle and complex issues we've worked through. So one is what we call the permanent chronoclone grief. What happens here is remember that we have the timeline. Let's say it's 8 minutes long, and we send something back in time, and it's standing right next to itself. I'm the one with the yellow circle. There's me. Once something falls off the timeline, it's committed. It's locked into place. The universe will always stay that way. Well, what if right now I went back in time, and that guy arrived 10 minutes ago, and now that has fallen off the timeline. I can no longer change that. So now if I don't go back in time anymore, I'm still here, he's still here. There's two of me permanently in the game. And so you can use that to actually clone entire armies. Now that's problematic because then it degenerates the behavior, degenerates the gameplay, and it's not that interesting anymore. It's all a battle of cloning things. So to manage that, you need to especially if you have carrier units. We have this big carrier takes 1,000 units back in time, and now we have an entire duplicated army with this one unit. So to manage that, we do things like limiting the number of units you can send through time via chronoporter. Have resource costs with that, such that it becomes it's still possible to do it in the game, but it's not economically advantageous. It's a very risky strategy, and you're not going to gain a lot from it. And so a lot of these types of things we battle economically in the game rather than but restricting what you can do. Another is what we call the grandfather paradox arbitrage, where suppose you have a factory, it's a cheap little factory, and it builds this expensive carrier. It took a long time to build, it's super expensive, super powerful. Well, now you take that carrier back in time, defeat the factory, and it falls into this loop of oscillating between the different paradox states. So the carrier traveled back in time, destroyed the factory. Now the factory never existed, so the carrier never existed, so it never went back in time to destroy the factory. Keeps looping, and then it falls off the timeline and assumes one of the two states. Either the factory will be left or the carrier will be left, but not both. And if you're a good player, you can time it such that you get the one that you want. So you've just destroyed the factory and gotten the carrier for free. And so again, we do this economically. We make it such that there's no factory that can make a unit that is that much more powerful and that much more costly than itself. So you can't really use that arbitrage very well. Or if you do, you're only going to get a little bit out of it and be wasting a big chunk of the timeline. Another thing is if you're going to clone resources or resource processors, you have a harvester, you have something that generates resources for you, you send that back in time. Well, now you just have that much more resources at the beginning of the game. So why not send our entire fleet of manufacturing facilities back in time, and now we just have that economic growth? Well, that's great and all, but it really degenerates the game plan. It becomes a race to shoving as much as you can back in time as far as you can. And so to mitigate that, we just said, okay, as a player, you're not going to be able to send resources back in time. You're not going to be able to send resource processors or those type of things back in time, or buildings. And it's not a limitation of the engine or the functionality. It's just a gameplay decision, and it helps make the game a lot more fun. So if you're going to implement time travel in games, these are some of the things that can jump out at you that you may not necessarily think about initially, and then a player starts using it, and the gameplay is very different. Now, a lot of people think about the notion of home time when they think about time travel. So let's say I go back to the 1800s. I go fight in some war or something, and then I come back to, when is my home time? When do I come back to? Suppose I go back to 1800, I age a year, and now do I come back right when I left? But I'm a year older. Or let's say I was back there for 30 years. Now I come back and I have more gray hairs. So do I come back 30 years into the future? Do I age with my peer group? And if you throw relativity into the whole thing, that just it makes it all a big mess. So really there's not a common definition of home time that some people sort of think there is. You can make one and say, here's the home time as it works in our game, but there's not an inherent notion of that. Now, another thing is if we're going to be changing the past, what is the player going to experience? How do they, if something changed in the past, am I going to just pop over 10 feet? What am I going to see? It helps a little bit if you're going to have drastic changes of the timeline if your player is slightly dissociated with the avatar. For example, some RPGs, real-time strategy and tactics, sports games, you can go back in time and say, oh, let's try this different play in this football game. Well, you're disassociated. You're the commander, so it's okay. And it's also better for multiplayer because of the association. Different players can jump back in time and change things in the past. Another thing about overlaying time is, I'm just going to gloss over this sort of briefly, is with regard to dynamical systems theory. So we have these different attracting states and fixed points. So let's say that somehow you go back in time and do the obvious, and you're your own parent, you're your own father. How does that how did that come to be to begin with? It can stay that way as long as you keep going back in time and creating that process. But how did it get that way in the first place? What attracted the entire timeline into that position? And sometimes the fixed points, those resulted timelines, aren't attracting. For example, the movie Minority Report, which I'm about to ruin for you, at the end of the movie, the guy just says, "Oh, all I need to do is hire this guy," and everything just fell into place because of, these beings that could foresee the future, these people that could foresee the future, will say, "Oh, well, this is going to happen," and it just pulled the whole thing into the timeline. Well, really, that's not an attracting state. What if he'd hired 2 people? What if he'd hired 3 people? What if they hadn't seen that? And so you need to think about, how, if we have these different changes of the past or these different time waves, how will that pull the timeline into a consistent state? And what type of state will it pull it into? So now, if we want to have like a single player game, or if we want to say, what if we sort of want to traverse this timeline, traverse all of our possible decisions, we can sort of have a causality overlay. This is like I was talking about before, Winterbottom or Chronotron, where you go back in time and you bump off, I bump my younger version of myself, and it's not going to affect me. I shoot him with a paintball, my shirt's not going to get that splatter on it. This works very well if you have a very tight association with your avatar, if you're playing a first-person shooter game. A platformer like Braid, things like that. It's a little better for single player. But the trick is, when do you merge? If something changes in the past, do you ever merge it? And so it becomes a little tricky with multiple players. Not that it can't be done, it's just a tricky gameplay mechanism. And there's also some reversibility issues in terms of, what if I have these different branches of the timeline, I go back in time, I make a different decision. How am I traversing this tree of time? If I go forward again, which choice do I make? Now, if you're implementing this sort of stuff in a game, you also need to worry about the player. What can the player handle? What is their mental capacity? And you want to leverage their memory of the past. The player just played the last 5 minutes of the game, so they're going to know it very well. And so if you're watching, saying, "Oh, what are you doing?" You might not pay that much attention, but if you're actually there, it's fresh in your mind. So you can go after the Groundhog Day effect. You want to leverage this. You want to say, "I know I just did this battle, so let me jump back in time, and I know what happened." The only trick there is you want to make sure that you don't overdo it. So for example, if you have a 30-minute time window, the player may say, well, there's 30 battles here. I think this happened here. It's just a lot for the player to manage. And so you need to keep track of their mental stack depth. How many things can they remember? How much time can a player, given the mechanics of your game, actually keep in their mind at the same time? What type of cognitive load are you going for? And how many critical decision points are you going to keep track of? And will the player need to? You also need to manage the player's tolerance for unobserved changes. If I go back in time and change, the little butterfly effect, I change one little thing and everything is different, that's not going to be a very fun game because I'm going to be confused all the time. But if you keep, I'll talk about this a little more in a few minutes, if you keep the changes local, it's much more manageable, much more fun. The player can jump back in time and say, oh, I see you changed this. I can sort of predict what might happen from that. And if you don't prevent confusion, you end up with people like this. So let's say that you're implementing time travel in your game. Now, how does this affect you? Well, one is it helps to decide that you're going to make a time travel game up front because there's a lot of issues involved. Like any game, it always helps to think, or software development project, it always helps to think through as much as you can up front. If you're going to add reversibility, you need to make sure that it permeates everything in the game. When someone says, oh, I know, we want to have this certain mechanism and this certain physics, well, you say to them, okay, design it with reversibility in mind because it's easier to do now than later. Most things, especially in a lot of physics simulations, reversibility isn't that much of a problem, but there's a few tricky issues you need to worry about. And also, how do we want to store deltas? How big are the deltas we want to store? Do we want to store the entire state all the time? And then if you're going to manage the time travel in the game state and you're going to have an entire editable timeline, well, now you're restricted a number of ways. Memory becomes extremely important. So when we're developing Acron, Mike will say to me, hey, Chris, I want to store this amount of data. I need 2 more bits. I'll say, okay, give me two bits I can take from something else. We're literally talking in that tightness. And you also need to manage a cache as well. How much can you fit in a cache line? And you need to be able to quickly recreate everything in the game, all your spatial indices, your occ trees, your KD trees, whatever you're using, all your caches. When you jump back to a new point in time, do you quickly refresh all your caches, or you do it lazily and wait? It just depends on how you're using them in different parts of the game. Will each time wave share some of the same caching structures or not? These are some different design decisions you need to make. And then also a subtle issue, which actually turns out to be very tricky, is when one time wave overtakes another. So if I'm sitting here and the time wave is coming by, at what point do these time waves sort of start clicking together and synchronizing? And you need to manage that synchronization process. Now, if you scale these algorithms across a distributed computation pool, then you need to manage that across not just different, maybe different threads, but even entirely different machines. And so you need to make sure you keep the state across all the different machines as well, and synchronize that. Some of the gotchas are, people will say, hey, we want to make this great idea that we read in this book about time travel. We want to make a meta-time weapon where I shoot somebody and they've never have existed ever. Well, how do you actually do that? Because if I shoot somebody and they've never existed, there's nothing to prevent them from having existed in the first place, and so they exist again. And so the only way you can make that weapon work is by having the bullet or whatever the gun is doing travel back in time and hit them wherever they were at some earlier point in time. And that's really the way that you have to do it. So like I said, some of those things in science fiction, they say, oh, that's pretty obvious, but you have to think about the underlying mechanisms if you actually want to pull it off. Another is, especially if you're making different types of games, how do you manage the player commands? So let's say I'm a soldier on a ship, and the ship is heading north. We're at 30 knots or something, and I'm going to walk 10 paces to the right and grab something. Well, now the ship, somebody goes back in time and says, hey, we wanted to fight a battle over here. The ship is now moving 20 knots west and has been for a day. Well, now we walk 10 paces to the right. Is that 10 paces east or 10 paces to the right? If you walk 10 paces east, maybe you end up in the water, and that's a bad thing. Or suppose that you're on a train and the train has changed tracks. Now, if somebody said, oh, I want you to move over here, and the train is over here, do I still want you to move over here? Do I want you to walk 50 paces out of the train? So you need to worry about the moving platforms and buildings a little bit with that. Now there are prediction. A lot of games nowadays, you're computing the physics on all the different clients. Everybody who's playing the game is running a different physics simulation. Well, here there's a whole lot of state to maintain between all those. So you sort of need to have it centralized. So you can't quite do as much prediction. And so you need to manage that. And everything in the game needs to have the Markov property. It needs to be memoryless because you need to be able to reconstruct the entire system state at any point in time. And then how do we resynchronize things? Like I said before, across a distributed processing pool, how do we maintain state across all those? How do we keep the state synchronized between all the different clients, all the different servers? And then we also want to manage, like I said before, the butterfly effect. Keep things local within the game. So one I can't stress enough is determinism. If you're going to make a time travel game, everything needs to be deterministic. Sounds easy, you know, oh, games are deterministic. There's a lot of little gotchas in there. Especially with regard to random number seeds, you know, how do you still have random numbers at different points in time, and how do you keep that consistent, even though everything else is, you know, something's changing over here, this can't change because they're not affecting each other, the local effects. And so you want to make sure that if you have, let's say, a 4-player game, these 2 players are fighting, these 2 players are fighting, these 2 are time traveling, messing up the timeline, these players are not. These players should not see anything different unless there's actually crossover. You want to keep all the effects localized. One of the ways to do that is with visibility. You know, what can a unit see? What type of range is it going to look at? You know, if a unit is evaluating everything on the map and saying, oh, this is my best strategy, then you're going to end up with a lot more changes across the timeline. And so you want to restrict what they're doing to a little bit more local behavior. Now, time travel, how does it affect the development process? Again, determinism. I can't stress that enough. Now, upper layer bugs, you know, scripting, you know, unit interactions, those type of bugs become extremely easy to fix. Somebody says, oh, I just, you know, told this unit to move over here and it did something totally wrong. It ran up, you know, to the upper left-hand corner. There's a bug. Well, they save the game, and that save has the bug. It has the entire test case in the save, because the tester can just go back in time, replay it, and you know, you can fix it very quickly and very easily. However, on the flip side, the actual engine itself, if you find a bug in there, that is very hard. It becomes extremely difficult, because you can have a little bug that you don't see, and now it's trickled up, and finally you see it, you know, 3 minutes later when it manifests itself as a very different change in the timeline. You're like, whoa, where did this come from? So you need to trace back that bug to the very beginning, and it can be very subtle. So it's, you know, it's nothing for me to, you know, have Perl scripts chugging through 9 gigabytes of data to find the very first error. And it took us a long time to get the engine as stable as it is. We haven't seen a consistency bug in, I think, at least a year. And you know, we've been developing this thing for, well, since 1999. And so it's a very difficult problem to, you know, to get everything bug free and get it solid. And so pretty much you just want to log the entire system state and then trace back and say, where's the first change? And how do we define the first change? Because the data grows very quickly because you're changing so many things. So to sort of wrap up here, I talked about multiple different orthogonal time mechanisms. You know, some of them can add together, some of them are, you know, have different properties, how you implement them is different. And it's always good to decide on these type of temporal mechanics very early on in the development process. Think through the implications of, you know, oh, I want to make a time travel game with X, Y, and Z. Well, think through them first, because there might be subtle implications there. There might actually be really good things. There's a lot of emergent gameplay in there. And there's lots of untried possibilities. You know, time travel in games is, you know, very new. In the past, like I'd say 5 years, has been sort of the initial growth of this. And it pushes players to think in a new way. It pushes them to think through the causality of things. It makes players think much more about strategy. You know, in our game, you know, a lot of real-time strategy games sort of degenerate into a click fest, where I want to issue as many commands as I can in a certain amount of time. Well, if you can go back and fix your mistakes, but you're only allowed to fix a certain number of them with the chrono energy, you have to do a lot more thinking, and it becomes much more of a strategic game and brings strategy much more back into it. And it can do that to other types of games as well. So it just depends on, like, again, you know, what type of feel are you pushing for the player? What type of game do you want to make? So with that, I'm opening the floor to any questions.
So we've got time for questions, and I'm really glad that this talk is videotaped, because I think I'm going to have to watch it 2 or 3 times to make sure that I understand everything. But if people have questions, please go ahead. And remember to wait for the microphones to be passed around for you. Make sure it's turned, there's like a green light. There you go.
So I'm wondering, how your game incorporates a sense of the timeline change. And I know this has been covered in movies and sci-fi movies. I forget the name of the title of the movie, but one where he's a firefighter and he actually communicates with a CB radio with his dad, you know, and saves his father's life and makes different changes in the timeline in the future. So the other characters that aren't experiencing time travel don't have a way to get updated or synced a knowledge of the change that happened in the timeline. How does your game handle that?
So it's all with respect to locality. So for example, if I issue a command and I tell somebody back in time, hey, you know, this, you know, do something different, that needs to sort of percolate across everybody. And so if I say, you know, if I say something to somebody back in time, some message, and it slowly trickles out, that's sort of the way it works. You yourself are sort of outside of time in a way. There's things I can't talk about that right now with story, which we're not making public yet. But effectively, you have the ability to send a message back in time and sort of monitor what's happening in the past to some degree with respect to the time waves. Does that sort of answer what you're looking at?
Level, I'm just wondering, you know, do you have controls? The other players in a multiplayer game, how do they get an update?
Okay, I see. So yeah, so each player looks at exactly what you saw before, where you know you see I'm at 3 minutes into the game. This is the system state that I see. Another player's at 5 minutes into the game. This is exactly what I see. And you see what you continue to see exactly what you saw, even if the other player is changing the past, until the time waves bring that change across. And when a time wave comes by, you see the screen blur, a flash goes by, and you can actually watch the changes as it propagates. So you sort of see that it's coming up. And one player, for example, can be paused and micromanaging things while the other player is still playing in fast forward at a different time.
Died in the past now because somebody's gone back and killed you, you just become dead? Do you see the wave go across? And
it propagates your death, yes. Mm-hmm. And everything that you have done will be undone as well in the previous timeline.
So my sort of intuitive sense is that even for like RTS games where there's hundreds and hundreds of units, that the dynamics of activity over time, recording that seems to me to be pretty sparse relative to the capabilities of a computer, but that compared to the computational cost of managing the timeline when you have to make an adjustment, that's actually much more complicated. Is that?
Yeah, you're pretty much on the mark there. The basic real-time strategy mechanisms underlying this are pretty easy and straightforward. The tricky things are in terms of computing visibility. What can a unit see? And also keeping another big thing we have to manage is the cache, because we have all this data we're shoving through the processor all the time. And so how do we chunk that into different sizes and keep it as much on the processor as we can? And so those are actually a lot of the constraints that we deal with.
So it sounded like you take time. So like say you wanted to make a log of something that happened, like an RTS gameplay. In a log, you abstract away a lot of the details and just do somehow capture like snapshots. Mm-hmm. But it sounded like there was, for the RTS or maybe for the engine that you guys developed, there's a lot of data a lot more than I would think that it sounds like you need.
There's trade-offs there, yeah. So one of the things is, do you keep all the data or do you just keep the deltas? And it basically turns off to a trade-off between CPU and memory. If you keep more information, it's more information, but you can jump back to a new point in time or jump to a different point in time, and boom, you have it all there in a certain tighter bundle of data. Versus if you need to reprocess it and just store some deltas and some logs, now you need to pull all that through the cache and recompute all that first.
So for different genres, would you be able to make different trade-offs because you don't need as much precision? Say, like an RTS where you don't care about exact unit position, but you care about an NPC's actions over time. That's kind of a less detailed.
Exactly. If you're doing a first-person shooter, you're not going to want a tile-based grid. You're going to want a very smooth feeling. When you take a step, you move that little bit. So yes, you would need to store different sets of data, different granularities. But then again, there's also different a different number of units in a first-person shooter. You're not fighting against 500 opponents, so you have all that extra memory free to manage it differently.
Chris, I want to talk about this whole fear factor because there are different fears in games. I mean, something suddenly jumps and yells at you on the screen, you just fall off your chair. That's one type of fear. And then you have a fear that your guild is going to murder you if you make a mistake. And that's a different sort of anxiety almost.
Yes.
And then there are fears, so to speak, about what will happen next. They're slow. Just will I be able to quest fast enough to level up as I need or whatever?
Yeah.
Depending on the type of the game. It looks like your game can still have this kind of instant scare. And it actually removes some of those long-term existential anxieties because you can fix things in time, but adds others because
exactly.
now the past is unpredictable as well as future.
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up. There's a couple things I'm going to say. One is the sort of canonical game that I like to talk about where I built up a big mining facility. Mike, who I was playing against, brought in a big army, just crushed it. So I went back in time. Brought over my army to meet his, so it defeated his army. He went to the future, researched his nuclear tech tree, sent a nuke back in time and nuked my mining base and the rest of my army after he'd already weakened it. So then I went back in time further, never sent my army, never built the mining base. His troops arrive, they get hit by his own nuke from the future because they're just sitting around there idle. And at this point, Mike was attacked by the third player in the game, and he ran out of chrono energy, so he couldn't go back in time and do that. And so he effectively nuked his own troops. And so there's sort of that there is that pressure of I can change the past, but there's also that limitation. So it's all the trade-offs you need to make. Another thing with just from a social perspective that we've been experimenting with, I'm not sure if this will be any form of default in the game, but the option will remain, is dynamic alliances. Now in games, if you say, well, let's be friends, let's work together as a team against this third opponent or these other couple opponents, or let's be together. Well, most games, you say we're going to be friends to begin with, and then we're going to stay that way through the game. But some games allow you to change that throughout the game. So we're going to be friends now, and oh, I don't think this is working out. Let's each go our own way and fight against each other. In this game, you can go back in time and say that relationship between us fighting together was a bad idea. I'm going to have never entered that relationship to begin with. And so now all of the collaborative efforts we did are not collaborative anymore. We're going to be fighting against each other. And so it gives you that ability to sort of reevaluate everything in the game.
Sure.
How do people cope with that emotionally? Have you,
Ask me that again after we've had an open beta test.
Okay.
We just have about 10 testers right now that have been working through it, but it'll be very interesting to see how the social dynamics of that when we actually deploy that to a wider scale.
Seems like you've putting restrictions on superposition that you outlined, like you can only take so many things back, or you have a cost function, really violates, conceptually what would be possible if time travel were possible in the physical world. So how are you going to answer that, or is that going to be
so how do we
coming up
justify
as
that?
Yeah.
So a couple things are we have the chronoporter gates, and we say it costs energy to send things back in time. And so that's pretty obvious. It takes the amount of mass that you're sending back in time takes a certain amount of energy. And so we just say the big buildings, the big carrier units that you can't send through time, they're just too big for the size of the chronoport gate in the game. Now in the story, that's an entirely different matter because you can have things at very different scales. But for a local effect, a local weapon, this is their capabilities. And so we do attempt to justify pretty much everything throughout the story. Like I said, there's some things I can't comment on yet, but we've thought a lot about that.
So in terms of gameplay, if I take some units back in time and I'm there back in time and I give them some commands and they perform that, and then I return to another time. I return to the present or go to another time. Those units that were at that previous time, they finish their commands, and then they just go into a default behavior.
That's another good question. So, because you are moving all over the time, we want to make that as seamless of an experience as we possibly can. So we've introduced a few things in our real-time strategy game that aren't present in a lot of others. One of them, which we call Smart Idle, where if you enable that, units will do basic, simple things that you would want to do for them. A unit is in the front line, it's getting damaged, it's going to go back for repairs as long as it judges that the situation is such to do that. If you have a command hierarchy just sitting there idle, part of it gets attacked, the whole thing will respond accordingly. And so we're trying to minimize the amount of micromanagement you need to do to play the game. We don't stop you from doing it. You can still reach in there and grab and tune things however you want. We also have another option, which is auto hierarchy, which will, if you turn that on, when you're not interacting, it will set up the hierarchy trees automatically. So let's say your commander gets defeated and you still have your army, it'll rebuild part of the hierarchy to maintain all those type of different behaviors.
So it seems like, so tell me if this is the right characterization, it seems like a lot of the gameplay that you get is, it sort of leverages the fact that the dynamics that are interesting to the player are all focused around units. So the units and their behaviors over time. So in a game, say, where you're solving puzzles, the player is actually present to explore an area and figure out some new knowledge that's going to enable them to do something later on. As you travel back and forth through time, of course, the player's knowledge stays the same. So anything that they've learned through one timeline, even if they go back and change something, they still have that knowledge of where the golden key is, or how to open the prison door or something like that. And that can't be manipulated because it's not grounded in like the units and their states.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. So we do a little bit of that in the single player game. We're planning through some of those puzzles like that. But you're right in the multiplayer game where you have, it's very interesting for the serious gaming aspect because you can effectively model loss of information asymmetry. Because your opponent knows that, hey, I'm going to go to the future and scout and see, oh, you're moving these troops here. I know what you're going to do. Let me go respond accordingly. And so the neat thing about this is it actually pulls people more towards a Nash equilibrium of the game. Because they say, oh, I see you're going to do this, so my best response is to do this. Oh, I see you're going to do this, my best response is to this. And it coalesces and attracts them to those Nash equilibria. And so it's very interesting in that regard from a game theory standpoint.
Other questions?
Well, first, if it's a real-time strategy game, now it's anytime strategy game.
A meta-time strategy game, as we're calling it.
And the second, the development of game itself as a game element is replaced by the plot development. So you have different plots and you actually meta level of playing the game instead of it, right?
So we're actually keeping a little more of a consistent plot, but there's nothing to stop that. That's just the way we've decided to do the game. You could take this entire mechanism across an entire game. You could even take it to, we've been talking about applying it to different genres like an MMORPG on a very long time scale with a very long, very, very large series of servers, where suppose you come home after work, there was a raid that happened 5 hours ago. Oh, let me go participate in that raid. And so we're not actually doing sort of the meta level stuff in the story in the game, but there's nothing to stop another person from doing that in another game.
Actually, this brings back to the question of degenerating content for the games, because you can use a saved game chunk as a content for somebody else's game, as you just said. It's a raid 5 hours ago, you can give it to somebody.
Or for example, you just lost this battle, go win it. Go back in time and manipulate the timeline to go win it. That's actually one of the ways. So in all of our testing, we found that if you just throw a player in and say, hey, go use this time mechanism, a lot of times they sort of scratch their head. They don't use it until they actually need to, or they've lost a few times. But if we force the player to start thinking about time initially, like give them a sort of save state or give them a scenario, they start using it initially. So one of our earlier tutorial levels is there's a base across the map. It's under attack. It's heavily a huge amount of damage being dealt. You've got a series of tanks across the map. If you run over there, you're never going to make it in time. The base will be destroyed by the time you get there. So you need to jump back in time, take the tanks, and then start moving them earlier. And we even have things like estimated time of arrival, so you can say, if I'm here, will they get there in time? It'll actually show you on the timeline the time it'll take. And so forcing players to play through these type of scenarios, just like you mentioned, these type of replay things, gets them actually using the timeline much sooner, much more easily. Mhm.
iteration. And so would it be applicable somehow to model this iteration and then come back and make some changes in retrospect, and what if we did this differently, what would happen then?
Possibly, you could, you could conceivably integrate this with your change management system, and effectively, look at all the branches as this big timeline. What was that? And have exactly, yeah, you could do that. We haven't thought through all the implications of that, but it's an open area for investigation.
In some science fiction stories, there's a common happening where somebody interacts with you and does something good or bad, and you don't realize it, but it's a future version of yourself. Is that possible given the constraints you've put on
Yeah, very
people's
much so.
avatars? Okay.
Yeah, like I said, with the yellow circles under the units, it'll actually show you. Well, we have a different mode of visualizing it as well, so that we have arrows. It's sort of an advanced mode where you can say, here's a unit that has time traveled back in time 5 different times, so there's 5 clones of it, and it'll actually show you an arrow of dependency of which one becomes which one. And if you click on a unit, you can say, oh, here's his age. This unit is 10 minutes and 37 seconds old, and this is the same one, but it's 12 minutes and 12 seconds old. So yeah, you can do exactly that.
And you'd be surprised.
Yeah. Well, so well, you can do it different ways in the game. In Acron, you as a player you can manage the chronoclones. You know who they are, but you don't know if your opponent has a chronoclone. So we don't show the yellow highlights for those units. So that can be surprised in a bad way. Or here's the evil twin that's actually the same guy. And then if you kill the younger evil twin, the older one disappears because he'll never have existed in the first place. But there's nothing to stop you from making a game or making a different type of game such that you don't recognize yourself because you're aged, you have a beard, you have what else?
So if there's my opponent has a clone that's been sent back from the future and they're fighting side by side, and I kill the younger version, but I stay in that time frame. The older version won't disappear until the time wave propagates to the future, and
Correct.
then to the point where they came back, and then it'll disappear in the past.
Right.
Where I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the games that you were talking about in terms of time travel, a lot of the gameplay mechanics were focused on physical gameplay mechanics, so like shooting people and running around an environment. That's pretty representative of most games. But there's a segment of games now that are starting to focus more on social sorts of mechanics, conversational behavior. I'm thinking like Microsoft just demoed this Milo game where you're interacting with this really rich virtual character. So there's all this information about conversational and social state that you need to manage, and there's, I would think, generally a stochastic element to the character's behavior, so every time that you play through the game, you're not going to get the same experience. I was wondering how that sort of direction for games, how that might fit in with time travel in your sort of game engine.
Yeah, so I'll talk about 2 points. First, I'm going to talk about the stochastic, and then I'll talk about the social part about it. So the stochastic part, yes, this is just like any other simulation where it's better to start with one seed and keep that seed throughout the simulation, even if you're going back in time. There's a lot of intricacies that we've had to deal with random number generation to make sure that the local random numbers stay the same, but if something else changes, the non-local random numbers are different. So you do need to manage all that, and so a different game, you just need to keep that consistent. So if the same decisions end up with the same thing. Now with the social games, I think that's really interesting. There was there's been a lot of work on that. This sort of brings in, like I said before, the information asymmetry, where it used to be, you didn't used to know what was going to happen, but now you do. So how might you have done that differently? And so it turns it much more into a learning process in that regard about your decisions. One of the key things that we've been looking at is what are branch points? What are the key decisions that affect the sensitivity or are the greatest effect to the outcome? And trying to focus on those. And maybe not even showing the player holding their hand and saying this is the thing that changes it drastically, but having them figure it out for themselves and maybe even mark it. So yeah, there's tons of unexplored space here that we've just started to think about, but is wide open.
Is there one more question?
Just a follow-up.
That depends on a number of factors. The earliest, I would say the earliest possible release would be mid to late next year. There's a number of business implications. There's a lot of things going on now, but I can't give you any harder number than that right now. If I did, there'd probably be another clone of me here and another one somewhere else.
All right, please join me in thanking Chris for a great talk.